Hey, shalom, shalom. I want to start off by giving all praises unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai, Bahashem, Rachakwadash. I want to say Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Shem Shai. Yeah, man. Again, I want to say double honor to our apostles, to our elders who rule well. Blessed salutations to you brothers out there teaching and enduring truth and sincerity. This Rob Amar for the Nebraska camp. And I just want to go into a little history in reference to the Sanhedrin, okay, and how it, developed. Because in the book of John, you would go into John chapter 3, verse 1. It says there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, okay, and he was of the Sanhedrin. Okay, Nicodemus was of the Sanhedrin. Which is proof that all the Pharisees and rulers, in the Sanhedrin pretty much acted as a supreme court for the Israelites, okay? And the word Sanhedrin goes back to sitting together, okay? Which goes back to, conspiring or to breathe together, which con means with, inspire means to breathe, okay? And going into this, we have to understand that the Sanhedrin was not a normal setup, okay? There were traditions that were created, just like the when Yahushua was put on the cross. Before he was put on the cross, they had a tradition where they let a criminal go, or they choose who they'll let go. And that tradition was, traditions of men. As the scriptures tell you, they created traditions of men. Matter of fact, let's pull that up. All right, so in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophies and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Yahushua." All right, so pretty much what had happened is, like the scapegoat concept, which goes back to the atonement, that goes back into that, but they use that as releasing a criminal or another two criminals, and they choose it. So they made it into a tradition of men, okay, changing, varying it to their own traditions, and that's what Jake tend to do. And this same thing happened through the Sanhedrin, okay, because you had the matter of fact, let's get the precept real quick, because I'm gonna be all over the place a little bit, because there's places that that supports it. So when we go into Numbers 11 and 16, it says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be elders of the people, and of officers of them, and bring them to the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with me, there with thee." Okay, so within that, it was 70 that was picked to do that. Okay, and within that 70, this was the concept that was engrafted into the Sanhedrin, and some say that's the origins. Nah, like I said, it became a tradition of men, where that was set up to spread out, because at the end of the day, you had priests, okay, but then Moses wasn't a priest, even though he was a Levite, and then after Moses, because Moses was technically a judge or a king over Israel, that happens to be a Levite, all right, because once it got to King David, then it was all Judites that were to sit on the throne, okay? And Moses, of course, wasn't a Judite, but he was the first person to sit in that seat of power, for lack of better words. All right. And, the Lord chose Saul first to sit on the throne. Moses was the first person to lead Israel as a nation, as you would say. But he was considered a king as well. Matter of fact, let's see if we get that. So when we go into Deuteronomy 33, verse 5, it says, we'll start 33, verse 4 for context. Moses commanded us a law, even the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. And he was king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people and the tribes of Israel were gathered together. Okay, so Moses it's stated in the scriptures that Moses was a king because it's just the seat he sat. And then within that, you got the council he had to tell him, like, hey, you can't do all this yourself. So set out people appointed to execute that judgment. Okay, so they say that's the origins, which technically is true and technically it's not, because they didn't have power like they had in the time of Nicodemus. Okay, because the king ultimately had the power. All right, they would spread out judgments, but where the Sanhedrin actually gained its power was through Salome Alexandra in the Hasmonean dynasty. Okay, and this is where the normacy of it changed, because with the Maccabean revolt, you had the Hasidians or the Hasidians, Hasidim, which goes back to the pious ones, okay, and going into Judas Maccabees and Jonathan, namely, where there was a robe put on him, okay, and I know I'm all over the place, but it's a collective piece of information. Jonathan was made high priest, but Jonathan wasn't from the line of Aaron. So that causes dissension or disagreement between the Hasidians and the Maccabees, because the Hasidians were the ones who fought with the Maccabees. And you can go to, I believe it's the Hasidians. I think it goes to 1 Maccabees chapter 2 and 42. Let's check that out. So it says, yeah. And it says, then, 1 Maccabees 2 and 42, then came there unto him a company of Hasidians who were mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. Okay, so these were called the pious ones, or Hasidim, or Hasidians. Okay, and these were Levites. Okay, so what happened was, it's double check. There's some other verses, and it said that it's referenced in 1 Maccabees 7 and 13 as well. Okay, where it says the priest of the seed of Aaron is come. And it said that translate to Bakides, a company of scribes, to require the things that they are just. It was just referencing them in 1 Maccabees 7 and 13. So that translation goes back to the Hasidians. But the point is that I'm making is that there was a portion during the Hasmonean dynasty where the Maccabees, which were Levites, they revolted against the Romans at the time. All right. Well, they're the Grecians, Salakia. It was Rome and Greece, but the Antiochus and the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasty or Grecians or Greeks. Then you had actual Romans. They all was kind of, the Romans and Greeks were kind of teeter-tottering between power. Rome was rising up. They already had a lot of power, but we were dealing with the Grecians at the time. All right, but the point is that during this time after the Maccabean revolt, which they're Levites, and then it revolted to do what? To get the laws back. And the Assyrians helped with that. Okay. And within that help, once Jonathan became high priest, when he was appointed high priest, it is speculated that when he became high priest, that was not according to, going into First Maccabees 10 and 21. That's not according to him being because John is not of the line of Aaron. Trying to say it in words to be understood. John was not of the line of Aaron, and high priests are supposed to be from the line of Aaron. So it said that the Assyrians disagreed with that, so they pretty much halted. And the Maccabees went forward, and not once they, the Hanukkah, they got the laws back and they were able to sacrifice properly. They didn't stop there. They continued to spread and gain rule. All right, and it became more of a dynasty than getting the laws back, which was nothing wrong with that. And that's how the Hasmonean dynasty expanded. Ultimately going into Simon or John Hyrcanus, sitting in a seat and sitting as a ruler, okay, being a king. That's where another transition happened. And what I'm saying is, I'm trying to get to is that the Levites, through the Hasmonean dynasty, the Levites had gained power and began to sit on a seat of, you could say, combining church and state, if you want to put it in simpler forms, okay? So with that transition happening, that's how you get the Sanhedrin, okay? Which is very important because before then, King David sat on the throne. You had, priests that would counsel and things like that. But like King Solomon the priests weren't the law. The king was, okay? But when you get to the Hasmonean dynasty, the priests then gained power. It wasn't through wickedness in its original form. That's why all Pharisees and Sadducees and those who are of the Sanhedrin aren't all wicked, because it stems from us trying our best to keep the laws under the oppression of surrounding heathen, the Romans, the Grecians, things of that nature. And it just made sure that Jake was keeping the laws, because in that time of the Grecians and Antiochus, there were laws that you go to First Maccabees, 1 through 11, really the first chapter in the First Maccabees, that'll tell you how our people, sought to get licensed after the heathen to do what they, to flourish in society, okay, which is going on now, all right? And our people had a system to hold court to make sure everybody's doing right, which is there's no, fast forward to now, there's no court. There is no place where Jake judges Jake, okay? Because that'll solve a lot of issues in itself as well. But just like the Sanhedrin, it can become corrupted because all it takes is one person to sit on there and have their own agenda. And when you get into your time of Yahweh Shai, all this is important, and it kind of brings things into understanding when you're talking about how Yahweh Shai was going back and forth with the Pharisees, and there was word about Yahweh Shai taking a seat and things like that. The original people, the Maccabees, wouldn't have been feeling any type of way towards Yahweh Shai. But what they created, then niggas here and there sprinkled into it. And then when they got into power seats, because they even, abused Yahweh Shai and say, hey, you talk to the high priest like that. You know what I'm saying? Like he was like some type of king. You know what I'm saying? And that shows you the amount of power that they've garnished and gathered. And matter of fact, I want to get that. So once you go into St. John chapter 18, we could go at 15. Just for context, it says, and Simon Peter followed Yahushua, so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Yahushua into the palace of the high priest. Okay, so once you fast forward to verse 22, it says, and when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Yahushua with the palm of his hand, saying, answerest thou the high priest so? Yahushua answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Okay. Now King Herod did sit on a throne, but King Herod wasn't he was sitting on a throne underneath the guise of John Hyrcanus. Pretty much it got all over the place where King Herod was doing Rome's bidding. He eating off of Rome, and then he's leaving the affairs to the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and it all got corrupted. Like I said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Herod being an Idumean, he's not even an Israelite. All right, and then the Sanhedrin, it just became this seat of greed. Okay, and they technically were keeping the laws, technically keeping the rules, but they were doing it like politicians. Okay, technically they weren't breaking certain laws, they were establishing certain laws, making sure, and it on the outside of the cup looked good. But that's why I said, the outside is like white mortar, but the inside is full of bones. Okay, because when you go into that Sanhedrin, like I said, you got Solemn Alexandra, which was after Alexander, the wife of Alexander, he had passed, and she sat in a seat, and she then gave the Pharisees and Sadducees, aka the Sanhedrin, power to run and rule the people. That's where they got their power. And then by John Hyrcanus sitting up as the first king, that set that situation up to where it was more random kings than the king of Judah, aka through the line of David, and then the high priest. It jumps around, but the high priest being the line of Aaron, that got jumbled around as well with Jonathan Maccabee. Okay, so I just wanted to get into it because once you go into Yahushua and how he was being governed, how the nation was being governed, and how they were saying there was wicked Pharisees, this should help explain it in history. The origins of the priests governing the people came from Moses with the intent to judge small affairs that shouldn't come to Moses. We should have read that, came across it with Moses' father-in-law, giving him the game. That's where that stemmed from. Okay, so that was the original intent of that. And then you go to the Hasmonean dynasty, where the Maccabees, aka the Levites, along with the Assyrians, fought to get the laws back because of Antiochus was telling our people not to serve the laws and to sacrifice swine's flesh, which in turn you get the Maccabean revolt. Once that was established and they quenched that decree, the Assyrians really stopped, because that was the whole point, was to get the laws back, to serve the Lord again, things like that. But the Maccabees wanted to continue and spread and get more control of the regional area, which is nothing wrong with that either. But when Jonathan Maccabees was given a robe and set as high priest by the Romans, that then caused a separation or dissension between the Assyrians and the Maccabees. All right. But then you fast forward to Simon, all right, or John Hyrcanus. I believe it was Simon he was the first king. He was set up as a king. Or it could be John Hyrcanus. But then, through that, later on through that, you had Alexander, then you had Antigonus, and then John Hyrcanus II. and all that, and then that's how Herod got in. But the whole point is that after Simon and John Hyrcanus, it pretty much got all bad. All right, that's when the Rome people started getting into the seats, and they started making leagues with Rome, and then you get Pompey, the one of the three. It was Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, I believe. But they was making leagues between Caesar and Pompey, and playing both sides and things like that. And then eventually, through John Hyrcanus II, the Idumeans got into power, and then after that, eventually Herod got into power, which he was an Idumean, because John Hyrcanus I was the one who made them convert. So that's how they so-called got into the door. Whereas John Hyrcanus I was a righteous ruler and a righteous judge, he just was making them convert, making everybody convert. You know what I'm saying? But John Hyrcanus II was a puppet leader. His brother was the one that was really trying to make sure we was on point, which is how Pompey just walked into our place, because his brother, I believe it's Antigonus, I get him mixed up, but he was not allowing it, and then John just opened the gates, which pretty much just made them lay down and get slaughtered damn near, and he had to flee. So all this is happening, and you got all these politics, but then you still have the Sanhedrin, you know what I'm saying? And they're going to, it's just a power seat, because we were a vassal state for a long time until the last revolt, okay, which then they just fully took us over when they destroyed the third temple. They just went on ahead and just made us a part of their system. Before that, we were vassal states, you know what I'm saying? So when you go into the time of Yahushua and you hear Yahushua saying he's the king of the Jews, and which technically by blood he was, by blood, because he comes from the line of David. Okay, comes from the line of Jesse, comes from through the line of Solomon. All right, because you got David and you got Nathan. One of his sons Nathan, and you got Solomon. All right, Yahushua goes through Solomon's line. All right, Mary goes through Nathan's line. All right. So with that being said, Yahushua technically was supposed to be king of the Jews, technically. You know what I'm saying? But it was Herod that was sitting on that throne. Not only was he not of Judah or the line of King David, nor was he an Israelite. All right, so that's why I said you can see how it's all over the place, which you see why Herod, being a false representative, was worried at the presence of Yahushua and the prophecies, and that's why he wanted to kill him, because he was sitting up there falsely. That's why the way they set it up, the Pharisees and the Sadducees through the Sanhedrin was settled upon their leads and like the power seat that Rome gave them. All right. And that's why I believe they even said within the scriptures that, we ain't had nobody ruling over us for years and years, even though Rome technically was ruling over them, but they were a vassal state. So they pretty much was free and just had to pay taxes to Rome. But at the same time, they'll say we'll have no king but Caesar. This is the nigga shit that was going on. You know what I'm saying? And that's why it had to be destroyed, because the root of judgment is the same way that these courts are set up. I can't say I'm sure that when Esau set up their court system, it was to, get judgment. It just was an organized spot to execute judgment for them. But ours was meant to execute righteous judgment and instill noble men, who known to keep the law. But it then changed. And then up to the time of Yahushua, it then, became a power struggle rather than justice. They were wresting a whole lot of judgment. All right. They were allowing, money changers. It was all kind of wickedness that was going on that they were omitting and allowing, within that time. So, yeah, man, hopefully this was edifying, because like I said, Nicodemus was a part of the Sanhedrin, but he wasn't wicked. which proved that there are men that were just up in there. Just like you have police officers. There's good police officers, and there's majority of them are pieces of shit. So it's along those lines. You know what I'm saying? So with that being said, I'm going to give all praises to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahushai, Bahashim, Rachakwadash, the honors to our apostles who are elders who rule well. Blessed salutations to the brothers out there teaching and enduring truth and sincerity. Shalom.